Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. In South Africa, it has just gone 4 p.m. and I'm really excited to be here in this webinar. This is the last of a series of 3 webinars. We've had a lot of fun over the last 3 weeks. We started off 3 weeks ago or 2 weeks ago with talking about abalone. Last week, we spoke about mussels. And this week, we are going to speak about oysters. For those of you that are logged on, don't panic. This is not an oyster on your screen. It's an abalone, and it's the picture that we've used for the whole series. But today, certainly, the topic is oysters and the oyster farming sector in South Africa. I like to think of mussels and oysters and abalone as the cornerstone of marine aquaculture in South Africa, maybe not only marine aquaculture, but aquaculture generally. Inland aquaculture in South Africa is limited, but certainly the marine production around these shellfish species is well established. They are strong sectors, and we've really enjoyed the last couple of weeks bringing you information around these sectors and subsectors of the South African aquaculture landscape. I want to remind you again that these webinars have been brought to you by Trade Forward Southern Africa. I will have Sim Dube from Trade Forward Southern Africa say something just now, but they've not only made these webinars possible, but they made a lot of the work possible that led up to these webinars, the creation of roadmaps for compliance for the export of these products to Europe. And I will be discussing that in a little bit more detail later on in today's webinar. Just a couple of basics for those of you that are not familiar with these webinars. Please use the chat panel. I can see some people are starting to chat already. It's always nice to hear from you. So tell us where you are, who you are. Tell us what company you're from. You might want to share. I've just seen Lise just sharing an email address. So thank you for that. But use the chat panel to reach out. Lots of interesting guests. Antonio from Mozambique, welcome. I see Patrice from Kenya. Brett Pringle from South Africa. I'm just scanning through the list here quickly. Alex from Zambia. And I can see lots of you starting to use the chat panel. Please also use the Q&A panel for your questions. It's easier for us to find the questions there as opposed to looking for them in the chat panel. So as the presentations go through this afternoon, post your questions there. We'll have enough time at the end to deal with them. This webinar this afternoon is going to be about 90 minutes long, depending on how the questions go, but we've got probably about 80 minutes left now, and certainly we want to leave time for your questions. The webinar is recorded, and both the recording and PDF of the presentation slides will be in your email tomorrow. You will have a link to those recordings. I will also share the email addresses of the speakers at the end of today's session. And really, it's just for you to sit back, relax, and learn. I'm really glad that we've got oysters on the, I don't want to say menu, but oysters on the program today, because it's one of the older South African marine aquaculture sectors. And certainly, I think there's potential going forward if the exports from this sector can be resolved. I can see the room is still filling up. We're well over 100 in the room now. We've had over 400 people register. Many people watch this webinar afterwards. So welcome to all of you that have just joined us. Tell us who you are in the chat panel, and we'll get the conversation going. In the first webinar, I've already said we dealt with abalone, in the second one with mussels, and in today's webinar with oysters. If you've missed any of the previous webinars, the links to the recordings are available. Jot down my email address at the end, and I'm happy to send you a link if you want to watch some of those previous webinars. Our program for today, I will finish off with the introduction shortly. Then I will hand you to Sim Dube from Trade Forward Southern Africa to give us a few welcoming remarks. I'll then ask Lisa Mazzoleni from the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment to also give us some remarks. We will then have a short video clip on oyster farming in South Africa, followed by a presentation by Imke Meyer on oyster hatchery practices. I will then give a short presentation on the TFSA work that has been done, and we will then go to questions and a discussion before we wrap up. Roughly at, sorry, it was 3 o'clock, not 4 o'clock just now when I told you the time. We'll wrap up roughly at 4:30, depending on how the questions go. Right, on that note, Sim, can I ask you to open up your camera and give us just a word of welcome from Trade Forward Southern Africa. Thank you, Sim.
Thank you very much, Etienne. I really appreciate this. And a special welcome to all our participants. I think this is a very important event that we are actually lucky enough to host with our partners in the aquaculture sector. So this is the third webinar on our three-part series. We actually, as Etienne said, we had our abalone 2 weeks ago on the 9th, and then we had our mussels last week, and this is last bit. For us as TFSA, Trade Forward Southern Africa, it's been very exciting to see interactions between suppliers and the markets. And really for us, it's also part of our ongoing dissemination of the updated South African roadmap to the EU compliance, as Etienne mentioned earlier. So just briefly, maybe I have mentioned to you, for some of us who've been attending this webinar, just about Trade Forward Southern Africa, who we are and what we aim to do. We are a 3-year project, which is sponsored by the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, FCDO. And we actually working in the SACU and Mozambique, Southern Africa Customs Union and Mozambique countries. These are Botswana, Eswatini, Mozambique, Namibia, and South Africa. And really the program aims to give capacity building and technical assistance to help grow trade, intra-regional trade. And we are very deliberate about our objectives, which are really to support particular value chains where we see value, where we also see them supporting a lot of our women in business. We also do quite a lot of information dissemination and trade promotion through our online School of Export, which is free of charge and available to help potential exporters to export as much as possible. We are quite aware of the growth in the aquaculture sector, and we believe it's a sector to support. So without taking too much time, I'd like to really thank the experts that are with us today who are sharing all the information around aquaculture. And as Etienne said, please sit back and interact, feel free to interact. As Trade Forward Southern Africa, we are here to actually support exports from the region into any other markets. Thank you very much, Etienne.
Great, thank you for those words of introduction, Sim. I will be saying more about the work that was done by Trade Forward Southern Africa in the shellfish sector towards the end of our webinar. I can proudly say that the work has already made a difference to the sector, if for no other reason than to link people to markets and also to stimulate the work around obtaining EU compliance. A lady that works in the sector a lot more than I do is Lisa Mazzoleni. Lisa is from the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment. And Lisa has been kind enough to give up her time this afternoon. I know she's been attending a conference. Lisa, over to you. You are welcome to take the floor.
Thank you so much, Etienne, for that warm welcome. Can I just share the quick presentation I have?
Yeah, please go ahead, Lisa.
Yes. Just for me, not picking up the presentation. There we go.
I can see it's starting to come through, Lisa, so just give us a second and it will load on our side. If you can just go into presentation mode, that's perfect.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you.
Right.
So from the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment, I am responsible for aquaculture investment promotions, so helping our farmers in the sector find investment and partners to help them grow, basically. As you know, as government, we look at sort of the potential benefits of growing the sector in South Africa. And we do this through enabling legislation, as well as our goals are to create sustainable job opportunities using aquaculture, foster economic development, capitalize on export opportunities. Very important to stimulate rural development and livelihoods. As I mentioned, attract foreign direct investment into the sector. It is quite a technology intensive sector, which requires lots of money. Also to safeguard sustainable environmental integrity and create SMMEs and wealth generation opportunities through aquaculture. So some of the key initiatives that we have taken towards market diversification and growth, particularly also in terms of the oyster subsector, we have developed a aquaculture certification framework. We have an updated and implemented a food safety monitoring program in line with local and relevant international standards. And we've done this with through collaborating with the relevant competent authorities. In terms of the marketing front, we have developed a public awareness and marketing strategy for products and the sector in South Africa. This was done in collaboration with industry, with other stakeholders such as retailers moving forward. We have also applied research to improving existing farming technology and sustainability in collaboration with industry, with a strong focus towards integrated multi-trophic aquaculture systems. In terms of multi-trophic aquaculture systems, this hasn't been done yet in the oyster subsector. However, it's been done in the abalone and kelp sector. Just some of the collateral and booklets that we have available. We have developed a recipe booklet. This is where we showcase aquaculture produce and how it can be made into different recipes. We also have sort of annual reports and yearbooks that we do annually through our different directorates. We have an aquaculture value proposition, which we've done with the Department of Trade, Industry and Cooperation. This is to showcase the sector, why people should come and invest, what incentives are available. So this is what we share with investors when we are having meetings or going to sort of exhibitions and conferences. Some of the activities that we've done to date, we've developed 6 videos to promote the different species. So we've done one for mussels, oysters, trout, catfish, tilapia, and abalone. We've also just recently done one for research. That is our director, Andrea, Research and Innovation, where we showcase our research centers, one in Sea Point and the one in Gariep in the Free State. I'll also share the link to that one. We have then done a campaign with the previous Mango Airlines. We had these videos showcasing on their in-flight television and also the recipes in the Mango magazine. We also do various social media campaigns on our departmental social media pages, which has quite a wide reach. So thank you. That's all for me, and I'll just keep an eye out for any questions and answers, for any questions in the Q&A box. Thanks, Etienne.
Thank you, Lisa. Really exciting to see big strides being taken by the department to promote aquaculture, and I'm sure there'll be some questions as we go along.
Yeah.
Right. Onto our program. The next is for me to show you a short video clip around oyster farming in South Africa. It's always tricky calling up these clips because some people don't have enough bandwidth to follow the clip, so it might be slightly staggered. If for any reason you cannot follow the video clip, I will put the link to the clip in your email tomorrow so that you can watch it in your own time. But I'm going to call up the video clip and then give me a second or so, and then it should be on your screen. So bear with us. Let's get it going. Colleagues, I've noticed that many people are saying that there's no sound. Let us try and improve that sound quality. If you bear with us for a second, we will try and improve that sound quality on that video clip. While we are working on improving that sound quality on that video clip, I want to welcome everybody that has joined us from the Philippines. It seemed that we've got a very big audience from the Philippines. And although we are focusing on Africa and South Africa, it's always good to foster these international relationships. Colleagues, I do believe we've got a slightly better sound quality on the video now. If you would bear with us, and we'll try and share it again. Colleagues, we're still getting several comments that the sound on the video clip is not coming through. My sincere apologies for that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to skip to our next presentation, and I'm going to check if we can get an alternative copy of this video to show to you as soon as the next presentation is done. These technical errors, unfortunately, when we go live, they do crop up, but let's see if we can get some better sound on that video for the people that cannot hear it. While we're busy with that, I'd like to introduce you to Imke Meyer. Imke is from the Pater Noster Oyster Company. They have been making headway in producing oyster spat locally. Traditionally, South Africa was an oyster spat importer, mainly from Chile, but there are strides and developments in that area, and I'm going to hand over to Imke. Imke, you are welcome to share your screen, and I can see you already. Your microphone is open. If you could please take us through your presentation.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Etienne. I'm just going to share my screen quickly with you.
Great. We can see it, Imke. You can go into presentation mode, and we'll take it from there.
Is that good?
Yeah, perfect. You can go ahead.
All right. Hi, everyone. As Etienne said, I'm working at the Pater Noster Oyster Company, and I'm the production manager here. And I'll be telling you a little bit about Pacific oyster spat production in South Africa. So firstly, looking at the Pacific oyster, it's native to Japan, and it's the most commercially marketed oyster globally. These animals are proto-androus hermaphrodites, so they firstly male, and at a later stage in life, usually 1 year, they turn to female. And there's no way really of telling the sex from the exterior. The only way to do that is to open up the oyster, take a sample from the gonad, and see under the microscope whether you see eggs or sperm. These are highly adaptable animals, and they can survive in a big variety of temperatures and salinities. So quickly looking at the production hubs in South Africa, there are not many of them. As I said, I'm in Oyster. We have a hatchery here, and then close to us in Saldanha, there are some sea farms growing oysters. Kleinsie has a hatchery, and Kubera, there's also a hatchery and a sea farm. So there are a few essentials for an oyster hatchery. Firstly, access to clean seawater and sterilization equipment is so important. Uninterrupted power supply, of course, as well. I think it might be sound strange to people from other countries, but in South Africa, that is quite a big challenge at the moment. Temperature control systems such as heat pumps, insulated rooms, laboratory space with microbiological equipment, and skilled and unskilled labor teams. It's a very labor-intensive process, and those teams are really important. Okay, so Oyster Hatchery has 5 basic functions, and I'm going to take you through them briefly. Algae production, broodstock management, spawning and fertilization, larval rearing and settlement, and then finally the nursery phase. Firstly, we're quickly going to look at algae production. So when I'm speaking about algae, I'm referring to phytoplankton. These are unicellular plants that grow in the ocean naturally. But what we grow is isolated species. We have at our hatchery 9 different species that we grow. And this is really important to be able to give the oysters a balanced diet, and also because the cells are different sizes. So the smaller algae sizes we would use to feed the larvae, and the larger, of course, to feed the adult broodstock oysters. So the culture environment needed for algae production is very clean, sterilized seawater. You need a light source. We have 24-hour-a-day light source to help our algae grow faster, aeration to give movement in the water, and CO2 supply, and of course, nutrient enrichment. So this is basically, you know, what your normal land plant would need, except for the water. If you look at the diagram on the slide, this is the basic process that most algae hatcheries use, and we use the same. We start at a small volume of around 60 milliliters, and then once the algae is grown to its full capacity in that volume, which is normally 5 to 7 days, depending on the species, we would inoculate a larger volume and so forth until we get to a 200 or 300 liter bag of algae, as you can see at the bottom right corner here on the slide. Now we get to broodstock management. I just want to mention about the algae, it's that it is actually one of the most important and the most expensive parts of the production system. I think that's important to mention. Next, broodstock management. We have broodstock conditioning, and this is a process that we use for the adult oyster batches that we use for spawning. This process takes at least 1 month during spawning season, and what we do is we take the adult oyster batches and we put them in a flow-through tank where the temperature is controlled at about 15 degrees, and we give them a high volume of algae, usually around 350,000 cells per milliliter. And this really helps them to regenerate their gonads. We call that gametogenesis. And of course, it takes around 1 month. It can take a little bit longer, but this allows us to get that process done faster, and we can rotate them throughout the spawning season and use them more regularly. These tanks need regular cleaning and also a lot of water replacements, regular water replacements. Okay, so the spawning. Once a broodstock batch is ready for spawning, we would take them and scrub them, clean them with fresh water. This is usually during the natural spawning season, which is in spring and early summer. So now we're standing at the end of spawning season. So the broodstock are cleaned and we put them in a spawning tank that has filtered, treated seawater, very clean seawater, at a temperature that is at least 10 degrees higher than that of the conditioning tank. And this causes a thermal shock, and normally they would spawn from just that thermal shock. If they don't spawn, you can also add a small amount of sperm or algae to help motivate the spawning. The duration of the oyster spawning is usually between 3 and 4 hours, but sometimes it does take longer. At the bottom right on the slide, you can see a photo that we took with the microscope. It's an oyster egg with a little sperm next to it and soon to be a fertilized oyster egg. Another method that we can use is manual fertilization. So this is usually done around the edges of the season, just before or just after the perfect spawning season, where the oysters don't really want to spawn naturally anymore. So we can use this, we open the oysters, we take a sample from the gonads to see if it's male or female and collect sperm and eggs separately. You can see in the image below a photo of oyster eggs, and we would keep them in separate buckets, add eggs to the spawning tank, and 10 sperm per egg, more or less. We would also add to the tank and fertilization happens. Usually after 24 hours, you'll have your D larvae, which is the first phase of oyster larvae. So larval rearing is the process of growing the larvae and looking after them in basic terms. So you can do larval rearing in static or flow through conical tanks with aeration. We use static tanks. So this is a 2 to 3 week process where the larvae is free living. They're between 75 and 250 micron. And they need daily monitoring. We check temperatures, pH, salinities twice a day, actually. And of course, we need to feed them. So 48 hours after fertilization, we start feeding the larvae. And as they grow, we increase the concentration of algae that we add to the tanks. At the bottom, you can see quite a nice diagram or image of how the larvae transition from D larvae at A up to G, which would be a pediveliger, and H is where it actually started building its shell. We're going to get there now. These tanks that we keep them in have to be drained every 2 days for the larvae to be assessed, measured, and graded. The right bottom corner, you can see a more realistic photo of what an oyster larvae batch would look like. And as you can see, they are different sizes. They grow at different rates, and that's why grading is important. Larval settlement. So after the larvae have spent about 2 to 3 weeks in the free living phase, they start to look a little bit like the one, or actually pretty much exactly like the image you can see at the bottom of the slide. That is an oyster larvae that's closer to 300 micron, and you can see a little foot coming out there. So that's actually what they use to search around for something to latch onto. So what we do is we take crushed oyster shell, and there's a photo of that as well at the bottom of the slide, and we put that into the settling nets, which is on the right. And the larvae would then swim around for a day or two, and once they've found the ideal little grain of oyster shell, they would latch onto that and start building their own shell. So that's actually the process that we call settling, and this is where metamorphosis takes place. The oyster shell also allows us to produce individual oysters, because in the wild, they would normally settle on top of something else, or normally actually other oyster shells. So they build an oyster bed or oyster reef. So with these nets, they also have to be cleaned daily. Then finally, we get to the nursery. There is a photo of our nursery here on the slide. Once the oyster larvae settle and start building their own shell, we refer to them as spat. So when the spat reaches about 3 millimeters, we move them on to the nursery where they're in an upwelling tank, upwelling system, where we pump water through from our seawater dams or reservoirs. In those dams, there are algae growing naturally from sunlight, and it's enough feed for them. So we just pump that water through there to keep them alive until they're ready for sale. So at Paternoster Oyster Company, we sell spat between 4 millimeters and 20 millimeters, and we have average annual sales of around 20 million oysters. We sell mostly to grow-out farms locally, but also export quite a large amount to Namibia. We've had interest from Dubai, Italy, and Netherlands, but that has not happened just of yet. We are very excited about that and hope that that would be possible in the near future. There are some challenges involved, of course. If I can mention one, we recently had to do our PCR tests of our oysters, where every 6 months we have to test for certain viruses, and it's a very expensive process. It's about 170,000 Rand annually. So that's just one of those things. But I'd like to just end off with just mentioning the importance of oyster farming and the benefits of it, especially to the environment. I think that's something I'm really passionate about, and it's always something to just remember and keep in mind. So wild oyster beds have declined 80 to 90%, and this is due to over-harvesting. So by producing oysters without taking anything from the environment, we're allowing those natural populations to have a break and to recover. Another important thing is that oysters actually aid in mitigating ocean acidification. Their shells are made from calcium carbonate, and when they build their shells, they're actually removing carbon from the ocean around them. So in my opinion, oyster farming, when managed properly and done sustainably, it really has a positive impact on the health of our oceans. So thank you very much. And that is it for me.
Imke, fantastic presentation. And once again, thank you for your time and effort. Imke, I'm going to shoot off just with one question quickly. And that is, you've mentioned the possibilities of future export of spat.
Yes.
Can I assume that if we fast forward 10 years, is that where we want to be as South Africa? Do we want to be seen as a spat supplier to various international countries? Maybe just your opinion on that?
That is a difficult question for me to answer, I must say. You know, I speak to people in the industry and owners here. My responsibilities are mostly just the production. I just know that they're very excited about just having the opportunity to be able to export, obviously expanding our markets a little bit, and seeing the interest, especially from Europe, has been very interesting for us. And it's definitely something that we are interested in, but there are some barriers. I know that we have been trying for quite a while, but I cannot tell you in detail exactly what the process has been and the challenges have been.
Great, Imke, thank you. I'm really glad I lured you out with that question, because I'm glad you've mentioned the barriers, because that's where we focus some of the work from Trade Forward Southern Africa. Imke, yes. I'm sure there's going to be more questions. So if you can hang around, we'll take some questions towards the end. Colleagues, I see we've got some hands that have gone up. I will certainly give attention to those hands as we go along. As we said just before Imke's presentation, is we're going to try and resolve the sound challenges on the video clip. One of the things that we're going to try is to play it from a different computer. So Lisa is going to share her screen and see if we can get sound on that video clip as she plays it. Lisa, you're welcome to start sharing your screen. I want to ask everybody that's listening, if in the first minute or two you don't hear anything, please alert us in the chat panel and we'll try something else. But Lisa, if you can give that a try and we'll see if we can get sound on the video clip.
Okay, awesome. Let me just press play. Just play. Oh goodness. Let's try that again.
Lisa, there we go. I can see it
Yes.
starting to come up.
Can
Let's see
see
if we
it.
can get that sound.
Okay, just a second.
Yeah, Lisa, still no sound on my side. Colleagues, I don't know if anybody else has got sound.
And I'm a director and co-owner of Aquafoods SA. We've been farming oysters for the past 5 years.
Was the sound sharing? I just press share sound now.
Yeah, when you hit share sound, it was coming through. Thanks, Lisa. So if you can
Okay,
carry on.
perfect.
We cultivate oysters and black mussels in the Saldanha Bay region.
My name's Kevin Ruck. I'm a co-owner of Blue Sapphire Pearls, and we're an oyster and mussel farm in Saldanha Bay.
We purchase our seeds from Chile, or we get them if they're available from Kleinsie in the Northern Cape. On arrival at the factory, we put them in mesh bags. We take them out to sea, where they would stay for a month. We then bring them in for regrading. This goes on for 9 to 12 months until they're market ready.
And what's quite nice is that they are in the environment, so they are more like ranching than actual farming.
We sell our oysters to distributors, and they would supply chain stores and restaurants.
We have a very stringent monitoring program, which is run by Department of Agriculture. It's frequent testing of all sorts of contaminants that could cause harm to humans. The oysters actually are beneficial to the environment in that they filter all the organic loading out of the water and incorporate them into their own body, the shell and the flesh. So they actually sequester carbon by filtering plankton out of the environment. It's almost like planting trees.
Yes, we do own the farm. I'm a co-owner with my wife, and at present we employ 23 local staff members. We source all our staff from Saldanha Bay.
We employ 16 people at the moment. I'm a co-owner, so my staff own 20% and I own 80%.
The industry do not require highly skilled staff. The skilled part of farming would be in the form of divers, skippers, scientists and biologists, and most of that are outsourced.
There's been a few initiatives from government that have helped the industry grow. The Operation Pakisa was instrumental in providing us with additional water space and also factory space. Our farm personally has been trying to create a buzz around tourism to try and bring tourists to visit the farm and eat the oysters at source. In other countries, it's very well known that people like to go and fetch their oysters from source. Once you're eating oysters, the benefits are huge in terms of health, what you're getting from an oyster. Very rich in minerals and vitamins, and a lot of things that you struggle to get from other food. So for instance, they're high in zinc and vitamin C and vitamin B12, not to mention aphrodisiacs.
Great. Thank you, Lisa, for sharing that video. We got the sound sorted out eventually. Our apologies again for those challenges with the sound on the video. Like I said last week, whenever we show the recipe on the video at the end, we see the numbers drop. I think people get hungry and then they head for the kitchen. But we still got 150 odd people with us. I've got a short presentation on some of the export barriers, and then I can see there are many questions that are coming in. Some people are asking for the video. Some people are asking for the previous recordings. The link to that video will be in your email feed tomorrow, so you can watch it in your own time. If you were battling to follow the sound or the quality of the video through this Zoom presentation, then certainly you can watch that again in your own time. I'd like to just give a short presentation on the work that has been done by TFSA. TFSA over the last 2 years, I've been working with them to try and address some of the export barriers to farmed shellfish from South Africa. When we started this project 2 odd years ago, I was very naive in thinking that we would move a couple of things and make a couple of interventions, put a few monitoring programs in place, and the export to Europe would be resolved. Little did I know how complex it is to meet all of the export requirements. We spent months analyzing the EU regulations. Ian Goulding, that was working with me at the time as an expert, did a lot of work in developing not only a roadmap for compliance, but also reviewing the shellfish monitoring programs both in South Africa and Namibia. As I said at the start, I believe this work not only has contributed to understanding the export barriers, but also to set a path in motion towards meeting the EU regulations and stimulating not only our producers, but our government to do a lot more work towards making our sector compliant, and compliant in the sense that the products are safe, and compliant in the sense that they can export these products to other markets. So in the first webinar, I spoke briefly about how necessary it is to export shellfish to not only to Europe, but to other countries. In the second webinar, I spoke a little bit about the tools in the compliance roadmap. And today I'm going to shortly speak around some of the recommendations and some of the other work that was done in this sector by TFSA. I've showed this little diagram in all of our webinars, and those of you that have attended previously will know it by now. And really, I'm just trying to illustrate how important it is that South Africa participates in the global seafood trade market. At the moment, none of these arrows showing the movement of seafood internationally, none of them originate in South Africa, because our industry is at an infancy in terms of volume and in terms of getting our products to other markets. However, this is the motivation behind dealing with export barriers, so that our products do comply and so that we can enter those other marketing opportunities. In last week's webinar, I also spoke about the tools that have been developed. I've mentioned the guidelines around compliance. I've mentioned the work around monitoring programs, and I've mentioned the development of compliance roadmaps. Those documents, which I've showed in the first 2 webinars, look like this. There is a roadmap towards EU compliance, one developed for Namibia and one developed for South Africa. Both of these documents are available on the Trade Forward Southern Africa website, and I would encourage you to go and have a look at them. Even if you're not in the industry, it's got a lot of good information as to how to address trade barriers, particularly in this case, trade barriers to the European Union. I've already shown in the previous webinars that compliance to the European Union regulations really rests on 4 pillars, and I'm going to repeat this again. It rests on a pillar of aquatic animal health, making sure that the animals that are farmed are compliant in terms of how aquatic animal diseases and health is managed. The next is a food safety pillar to make sure that these products are safe from a contamination point of view. The third pillar is a veterinary drug residue monitoring program, which ensures the responsible use of veterinary drugs. Fortunately, in oysters, because they are farmed in the natural environment, very few to no veterinary drugs are used, which makes compliance to this particular leg very easy. And then the fourth leg, or the fourth pillar, is compliance in terms of monitoring marine biotoxins. Now, oysters are farmed as filter feeding organisms. They feed on algae and other organic materials in the environment. And these algae could, in certain circumstances, carry biotoxins, particularly when we get blooms of certain algae species. And that compliance makes up this whole structure of compliance to the EU regulations. I said today that I would deal with some of the recommendations out of this work that was done by TFSA. So firstly, in terms of recommendations that were made to shellfish farmers, was to get a good view of what the EU market really requires in terms of products. The reason for this is that compliance to all of the EU regulations costs time and money, and we don't want to go down an expensive exercise if we have not quantified the market in Europe. It does sound, excuse me, it does sound that there are strong markets for our shellfish products. However, in Europe, we compete with suppliers from various other countries. We compete with strong farmers around products like oysters. There are European farmers. There are European farmers of mussels. There are not European farmers of abalone, but we know there's a strong Far Eastern diaspora in Europe, which potentially could take up these products. The next is to assess the business case for establishing the required sanitary controls. I can say proudly that since this work by the TFSA has been done, government has put in significant effort to comply to these sanitary controls on behalf of the sector. The next is to prioritize the development of control systems. Government can put in as many controls as they want to, but at the end of the day, it's the producers that have to show that they can comply to these particular control systems. And lastly, an associated point is the establishment of strong cooperation between the national competent authorities and to ensure that the implementation of these systems take place. You heard Imke talk about the monitoring requirements. It's a cost and time input in a farm, and certainly there's a requirement for very strong cooperation if these costs in time and money are to materialize in additional profits from new markets. From this work, several recommendations were made to the competent authorities. Some of these include the following. It was recommended that there be more coordination, and I've put the little red word done, because we've seen far more coordination between the government authorities around establishing the control systems and establishing the systems that will eventually allow for the export of farmed shellfish from South Africa to Europe. There was also a recommendation to develop and adopt a prioritized phased action plan. A lot of work I know has taken place around this. This phased action plan, at that stage, it was recommended that it work around the classification of monitoring of specific areas for bivalve farming. A lot of that has been done. There were recommendations around residue monitoring of particular products for aquaculture. A lot of that has been worked on. And then there were recommendations around additional aquatic animal health monitoring that was required to meet the EU regulations. And I know some work has been done on that account as well. There were also recommendations to look at accounting for the benefits of improved control systems. The benefits of improved control systems in shellfish farming is not only to meet EU requirements. It also means that if there is comprehensive monitoring of quality and food safety, that we would have safer products for South African consumers. At the moment, a lot of our oysters and mussels are consumed in South Africa, and these control systems obviously benefit that market sector. There was also a recommendation around the consideration of pre-qualification. I'm not going to go into the detail around this, except saying that various authorities play a role in the control systems in South Africa. And pre-qualification is really just a way of saying that all of these authorities can play their role so that the national regulator of compulsory standards, as the recognized competent authority, can issue a single certificate to tell the European Union that our products are safe. I'd like to just very briefly tell you about some secondary work that the TFSA did during this program. It was very soon realized that the monitoring of harmful algal blooms required a set of skills in South Africa and Namibia, and all of these skills were not readily available. So work went about to identify how these skill sets could be improved. And we realized that by linking up with the internationally recognized program around training for algal monitoring was the best way forward. We linked up with the UNESCO program. This was a program run through the University of Copenhagen. And we realized that there were more benefits to bringing the skills into South Africa and Namibia, doing the training locally, than trying to take a lot of people to Denmark to attend these courses. So proudly last year, we were able to take 6 South Africans and 6 Namibians on an intensive training program. This program consisted of several weeks of online training and culminated in practical training in Swakopmund for around 7 days for these selected candidates. They were also examined, and they are now recognized by the IOC for their skills in harmful algal bloom monitoring. These are just a couple of photos of the training course. Top left and to the far right, you might recognize some of these people if you are in the shellfish sector. Our own Portia Duane at the top left there, sitting behind a microscope, learning how to monitor harmful algal bloom species. The lady from Amanzi Biosecurity on the right-hand side, also learning how to monitor some of these harmful algal blooms. Just to remind you, these harmful algal blooms, when they occur, the intention is to have an early warning system so that shellfish such as oysters and mussels are not harvested when these harmful algal blooms that contain toxins are in the area. So this training really played a critical part in upskilling the South African sector around the ability to create an early monitoring system so that our oysters and mussels do not or are not sold when they contain these harmful algal substances. The sector benefits from this training include now that we have internationally recognized personnel in harmful algal bloom training. There is more credibility around our monitoring program in South Africa. We now know that these programs can meet international food safety standards. We now know that even for South Africans, that the oysters and mussels are safer to consume, and for obvious reasons, those carry commercial advantages. Right, that is the end of my short presentation around the work that was done by Trade Forward Southern Africa. I'm happy now to take questions and comments. We have about 30 minutes or so left in the program this afternoon. I see various questions have been posted in the chat panel. Some of these questions have been answered by some of my panel members, but I'd like to give an opportunity for anybody that would like to ask a live question. I did see some hands up earlier. Excuse me. I'll try and get to those hands again, and we'll see if we can take some live questions before we get to other questions on the chat panel. Leanne Morris, your hand was up. Leanne, if I've got it right, you are from the Philippines. Leanne, I've opened up your microphone and you can go ahead and ask your question. Leanne, are you available to ask your question? Leanne, we're not hearing you, so I'm going to move on to the next person. Let's see who else we have. We've got, I think it's Aria Ma Prospero. Aria, you can go ahead and ask your question. I've opened up your microphone. Aria, you can unmute and ask your question. We're not getting any sound on that either. So let's try and move on to the next live question. Antonio Tonen, an old oyster farmer, old hand at oyster farming in South Africa. Antonio, I've just opened up your microphone. You can unmute.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks, Etienne. I've got a question for Imco. Imco, are you there?
I'm here.
Hi.
Hello.
Encouraged to see your progress in the hatchery. My question is around the genetics of your brood stock, because that is, all of us know is absolutely central to sort of the long-term success of the oyster industry is developing appropriate sort of bloodline, so to speak. How are you sourcing your brood stock and selecting it, and what are your plans in that regard?
Yes, so I think it's important to mention that I have been here at Paternoster Oyster Company for 1 year now. So this whole brood stock conditioning process only started last year, more or less actually with the start of the season, which is like around August. I started the conditioning process. So firstly, we have sourced our broodstock oysters from oyster farms in Saldanha. And I've basically just made oyster batches as we've brought them in. And the idea is to actually start testing that. And obviously we've used them for the season, but we haven't gotten around to testing the genetics of that, besides just seeing how certain batches do better than others. So that is definitely a plan that I have, but I have not been able to get to that in the last year. But we are certainly, that's the reason why we're doing conditioning, because in the past conditioning was not done, just new batches were brought in for spawning each time. So at least now we've built up some brood stock that we can start testing.
Yeah, if I can just expand a little on my question, there's a bit of research, some postgraduate students from Tammy Robinson's laboratory at Stellenbosch University, at sort of climate change related challenges to shellfish culture, particularly on the west coast of South Africa, and sort of, obviously broodstocks selection is going to be vital if the industry is going to survive the changes over the coming decades. Sort of there's very critically important broodstock selection programs on like all over the North American continent, Australia, Europe, and I thought, perhaps it would be worth your while to try and look at somewhere in the world where they might have comparable environmental conditions and see whether one could establish some sort of alliance with an established oyster breeding program, rather than, because it's a years long process, and it might be quite sort of, if you're the sort of only hatchery around, it could be quite a, you need a lot of resources which might not be available without academic research institutions and sort of government laboratories and things.
Yeah, I myself is a scientist, so I definitely always think about these things and try and, involve science and research as much as possible. So we're definitely open to that idea, and that is something I'm planning, and I'm always interested to speak to other scientists and involve them with research and see how we can improve, the entire industry for South Africa. I mean, that is the end goal. So I'm very interested in looking at things like that and improving it.
Great. Great, thank you,
Thanks.
Antonio. I think you've raised a critical matter, and Imke, thanks for your response to that.
Thank you.
I do foresee future work around not only, as Antonio said, collaboration with other hatcheries, but also looking at possibly how South Africa is going to be hit by climate change and what that could do to the industry. I'm going to try and take another live question. Just before I do that, Ixan, I think it's Ixan Carstens, you were asking on the chat panel around how we select candidates for the training. I can say that the harmful algal bloom training candidates were selected through interaction with the competent authorities, and particularly speaking to the competent authorities as to how we see the skill shortage and where the skill shortage is. I'm very proud to say that everybody that was trained in that course are actually involved in that value chain. So we didn't simply go out there and select people randomly. It was quite a careful process to make sure that those harmful algal bloom skills, monitoring skills, are used in the field. Then I saw there was a question from Stephen Pycroft asking for the materials from government. Stephen, I believe that question has been answered by Lisa. It's on their website. The Trade for Southern Africa material is on the TFSA website. So you're welcome to get it there. An interesting question from, I think it's Katrine Holfoot, saying that in, I think it was Ghana or Gambia, they use oyster shells as building material. Katrine, I don't have information on that, but I have seen it done in other parts of the world where they grind up oyster shells and use that in building materials. I'm stumped to give you anything more than that, but quite interesting if you come across something like that. I see there's a hand that has gone up from, is it Pumelo Mogodi? Pumelo, sorry, I see you've just put your hand down again. Pumelo, your hand is back up. Pumelo, you can go ahead and ask your question. If you can unmute, Pumelo. Pumelo, we're not hearing you. If you can unmute and ask your question. No, nothing there. And then I'm going to go to Hamid. Hamid, you must help me with the pronunciation. It's Diao. I think I've got that right. Hamid, you can go unmute and ask your question. Hamid.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I'm Ahmed Jaju. I'm working, I have a PhD in about reproduction and spite of Crossosea gaza, mangle oysters stuff in Senegal. Donc, I have now you have a program Senegal was develop a program of chain value of oysters Crossosea gaza. It's possible to develop cooperation with South African Research Institute to share the experience. You know. Thank you. Thank you.
Great. Hamid, thank you very much for that. And this is the value of these webinars. Imke, I'm going to share Hamid's information with you. And as you've just heard, they've asked for a sharing of knowledge. I think, Lisa, maybe there's somebody in your department that might also be interested in sharing knowledge with Senegal and their oyster program. Right. Looking at the hands that are still up, there are several hands. Let's try and take some of the questions on the Q&A panel. Tristan saying you've studied at the University of Stellenbosch and you're looking for more opportunities. So if anybody online has opportunities for Tristan to continue his studies in aquaculture, please be in contact with him. Then I see several people, Tristan, have answered you on the Q&A panel to speak to Rhodes University. That's one option. Trying to get to some of these questions. Stephen Pycroft again. The liaison between government and the oyster industry is not as collaborative and supportive. So that's why I was interested in your support resources. Lisa, can I ask you to maybe just comment on that? I see a lot of effort coming out of government. Lisa, your view on that?
Thanks, Etienne. I think he was referring to the Australian side, because he said, I asked him if he's got any resources from Australia, and I think this is his answer to that question. So I think it's from the perspective of the Australian side, if I read correctly.
Great, thank you, Lisa. I always like dishing the Australian government, so give me that pleasure. No, I'm making a joke. Stephen, I believe that question has been answered, so you can get those materials from Lisa. Going on to a question here by Gloria Justin. Gloria saying, great presentation, Imke. How long do your oysters take to get to market size after being planted in the ocean? And what are the intervals between tumbling and grading? Imke, I see you typing an answer, but maybe you can answer live. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. I was just busy typing there. So yeah, I probably should have mentioned that, but the whole process for an oyster to reach cocktail size, I would say, where you would eat it, is about 18 months. And then she was actually asking after being planted in the ocean. So, I mean, it really depends on the oysters themselves and the conditions, but I would say at least a year or a little bit longer in the sea farms. Obviously, I don't work in those areas. I'm not 100% sure, but I can just try and guess from how long we would hold the oysters before we send them on, because I know the total process is about 18 months. And then the intervals between grading. Yeah, so I think I did mention a little bit about that. The really small spats we would grade weekly, and I believe the largest spat in the nursery is also graded weekly or bi-weekly, I mean every second week, depending on the sizes or how much we're selling. It really varies, but at least weekly, I would say.
Great, Imke, thank you for that insight. We're putting you on the spot being a hatchery person. We're asking you production questions. That's fine. Thank you, Imke. No, I'm going to try and take Leanne Morris again. Her hand is still up. Leanne, we've given you permission to talk if you want to ask your question.
Hi, how are you? Good morning. Leanne here from National Fisheries Authority in Jamaica. Sorry, I got a bit distracted, but I do have a few questions for you. One that is important is you spoke about the time period for the framework, right? To make sure that you can export your oysters. Exactly how long did it take you? That's one. And two, I'm not sure, I was skimming through the chat to see if the cost for production question was answered. So I'd love to ask that question as well. What's the production cost for oysters? Especially for the, and of course, how long does it take for the oysters in South Africa to be ready for sales or consumption? So those are my three questions.
Great, thank you for those good questions, Leanne. And I will be speaking to, I think you're based in the Philippines, if I've got it correct. just firstly on the program to export oysters, I can tell you honestly that South Africa has been working for many years to address compliance to EU regulations. Several efforts were made in the past, and it has taken a long time. The particular program that we worked on with Trade Forward Southern Africa was a program that was launched about 2 years ago. As it is right now, we are not yet exporting, but expecting to export in the very near future. When I say not exporting, I'm particularly talking about the European Union markets. Our abalone in South Africa is exported, the bulk of that is exported to the Far East. There are other export countries, for instance, mussels that are going to the US. But to comply with the EU regulations, it has taken a considerable amount of time. I'm really excited that South Africa is quite close to exporting to the EU, but it is a fairly long program. Then, Leanne, on your question for cost of production and how long it takes, I'm going to check if Antonio is still online. Antonio, if you are still online, can you help us with these production questions, and maybe you can just help us out with the length of production and also with the production cost. Antonio, can I put you on the spot and ask you to comment on that?
Hi, Etienne. Sorry, I just had a bit of a connectivity issue there. So just have to take a few steps back.
Yeah, and Antonio, that's the beauty of this of these online Zoom platforms is we either struggling with connectivity or we put each other on the spot. So I'm putting you on the spot just to comment for us on production cost of oysters and maybe how long it takes to grow an oyster out.
And are you asking that question specifically for South African grow-out sites, or?
Yeah, specifically for South Africa.
Okay, so there's currently basically two centers of oyster production in South Africa. One, Algoa Bay in the Eastern Cape, and in Saldanha Bay on the Western Cape coastline. Two very different ecosystems. And growth rates, Saldanha is interesting because although it's in the cold Benguela, the solar effects of the big Langebaan Lagoon result in warmer water in the bay than your general West Coast ambient, combined with the very sort of rich phytoplankton communities of the Benguela. So one gets quite unusually fast growth rates in Saldanha Bay, although there have been recently some sort of indications that this might not be quite as fast as it used to be, and that might be to do with issues related to climate change. So it depends what you regard as market size oysters, but because oysters start getting sold at about 50 grams on the domestic market, and their markets right up to hundreds of grams. And the Pacific oyster is not called Gigas, Magellana Gigas for nothing. It can grow to well over a kilogram. So it's a tricky question to answer, how long does it take to grow? But I would say that realistically, for the kind of range of sizes that an oyster farmer can produce economically, you're in the region of between 12 and 24 months, both in Saldanha Bay and in Algoa Bay. What is different is that in Algoa Bay, with slightly lower nutrient and plankton regimes, the oysters tend to put more effort into shell growth than into their flesh growth. So you get different characteristics from oysters in the different bays, and it's not to say that one is better than the other, but yeah, slightly different growth rates and slightly different characteristics at the two areas. So if you look at that against the global picture, with the same species, the fastest anywhere in the world is sort of around 1 year. Is an interesting oyster farming project right now, sort of near the Gulf of Oman in Fujairah, which is producing oysters in just under 12 months. And the slowest would be in sort of far northern hemisphere, Sweden, countries like that, where it can take up to 4 years to grow an oyster to a reasonable market size.
Right.
And your costs are, they're very dependent on your growth rate, because your husbandry is kind of a constant. You have to attend to your oysters at fairly regular intervals, regardless of how fast or slow they might be growing. So it's a manpower cost, or a human power cost, should I say. So an interesting challenge, which every oyster farmer in Saldanha, for example, would know, is that in such a fertile system, not only oysters grow really well, every other fouling organism, be it a squirt or a barnacle or a mussel or a sponge, also thrives in this sort of nutrient-rich, plankton-rich environment. And that does push your production costs up. So margins are very thin. Farming is a very tough way to make a living. I'm sure in almost every farming sector, experienced people know that. And I think, farmers probably don't ever realize more than a 20% margin on wholesale prices, which is it's a tough way to make a living.
Great, Antonio, thank you for those insights and spoken from somebody that has farmed in this environment. So really appreciate you sharing that with us. We are heading towards the end of our program. We've got another few minutes, 10 minutes or so left. You will see that I launched a short poll on your screen. I want to please ask you to complete that poll. It's 6 multiple choice questions. It will take you just a few seconds. And that poll is really important for us to take these results back to TFSA so that they can continue supporting the sector. And these poll results are really important to show that there is interest in the sector for more support. I see we've got a response rate on the poll. I think we're sitting at about 67%. So let's try and get that over 75%. If you haven't answered those questions, please do so now. I will share the results of the poll in the next minute or so, but please give us your answers so that we can take these results forward. There were several other questions on the Q&A panel. There was a question to Imke around microalgae. Imke, thank you. I see you've answered that. If you're interested in the algae species, go and have a read on the Q&A panel. Then my good friend David Scarf. David, thank you for your offer around collaboration on the animal health aspects. I'm 100% sure there will be plenty to talk about. And I see Lisa has set up that communication with the relevant persons. I cannot overemphasize how important it is that we establish these collaborations. While you are answering those poll questions, and before we close off today, I would like to also share with you the email addresses of the various people that were speaking today. On your screen, you should be able to see those email addresses now. And then also, before we go, I would also like to ask each one of our speakers just to give us a closing remark. We've got about a minute or so left. Let's see if there's any other live questions. We couldn't take a soundbite from, I think it's Aira, Aira, I've opened up your microphone. Let's see if we can take a live question from you now. Aira, we're still not getting your sound?
No, sir.
Aira, do you have a question?
None so far, sir.
Thank you. And then there was a hand up from Pamelo Mogodi. Pamelo, I've opened up your microphone. Pamelo, are you there? All right, we're not getting any sound there either. Right, before we close off this afternoon, you can see the email addresses on your screen. The poll has now reached 76% response rate. If there are still some of you that have not responded, please respond to that poll. While we are taking those last responses, let's get some closing remarks from our fellow panel members. Lisa, can I start with you? Lisa, just a few closing remarks as we draw to the end.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone, for participating and joining. Thank you, Etienne and Trade Forward Southern Africa, for the platform. This is a really great platform for information sharing, and please don't hesitate to email me if you need any information or resources. Please go ahead and I'll put you in touch with my colleagues. Thank you.
Great, thank you for those last remarks, Lisa. Let's go to Imka. Imka, your final remarks in closing today.
Hi, you can see me. Yeah, I just wanted to say thanks to TFSA for this opportunity, and the Aquaculture Africa magazine as well. It was really interesting to connect to a few people, and I work here on a farm that's quite removed from what I'm used to, with like a lot of scientists and working with a lot of people. So it's really nice to connect in this way and learn about other things. And I'm anyone that's interested in connecting with me or talking about research that's being done or new developments in oyster farming, I'm happy to listen and collaborate on things. So yeah, thank you so much.
Great, Imka. I think your inbox is going to be flooded with questions tomorrow, so good luck on dealing with that.
No problem.
Just before I give Sim the final word, our response rate on the poll is up to 78%. Let's see if we can quickly get that to 80%. If you haven't responded to the poll, please do so. Just quickly answer those 6 questions, and I will launch the results of that poll in the next minute. The email addresses of all the speakers are on your screen. And on that note, Sim, it's your honor to give us just a parting comment. Thanks, Sim.
Thank you very much, Etienne. I've been from a Trade Forward Southern Africa's perspective. It's just to thank you all, really. I mean, to thank Imka, Lisa, yourself, and Etienne. I think this is a job well done. We've had 3-part series. That's been very, very informative. I've seen a lot of interactions. And really, for us as a project, this is what we want to do. We want to see people interacting, want to see people growing these relationships and actually getting to export as much as possible. And if we've done that, we'd have succeeded in our work. So a very hearty thank you from the project, and you're looking forward to more collaborations going forward. I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much, Etienne.
Excellent. Thank you for those last words. From my side, it's been fun having you for this series. That was the last one. Look out for the link to the recording in your email tomorrow. These recorded webinars will be on YouTube as well in the next day or so. So you can go and have a look at them there if you've missed anything. Because we come to you live, sometimes there are some dragons in the works. So my apologies for the battle with the sound earlier on. We've had a good session. The results of the poll are on your screen if you want to have a look at it. I will leave the email addresses on for another minute or two. And on that note, thank you. We're closing off, and thank you to Trade Forward Southern Africa. Great. Have a nice afternoon.